The afternoon I realized that doing the right thing might cost me everything I had just started building was the same afternoon the magnolia trees behind the football field first started dropping their blossoms. I can still see them in my mind, big white petals falling slow through that heavy delta air like they had all the time in the world. Funny how nature can look so peaceful on the exact day your life decides to get complicated. I was 27 years old that spring, still young enough to think a clipboard and a whistle meant I had some control over things. I'd been hired the previous fall to teach American history and coach the junior varsity football team at Greenwood County High, a squat brick school sitting between soybean fields and a narrow stretch of highway that ran straight as a ruler through town. My wife, Ellen, and I had only been married 9 months. We'd just signed papers on a little house with peeling white paint and a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side. The bank man called it a starter home, but to us it felt like a castle. Every evening that spring we sat on that porch with mason jars of sweet tea sweating in our hands while the screen door creaked behind us and cicadas tuned up in the trees. Life felt steady. Predictable. Friday nights meant red clay dust rising under stadium lights and the crackle of the local AM station broadcasting the game through a transistor radio perched on the concession stand. Saturdays meant church errands and mowing the yard while the neighbor's hound dog watched like he was supervising the whole operation. It wasn't a big town, Greenwood. Everybody knew who taught where, who married whom, and which pew your family sat in on Sunday mornings. And everybody noticed when things started changing. Integration had come to the schools that year, not with shouting or soldiers like you saw on television, but with a quiet sort of tension that hung in the air like the humidity before a thunderstorm. A handful of black students had enrolled that January. Most folks in town said polite things about letting the courts handle it, but you could feel the unease in grocery store aisles and barber shop conversations that went quiet when someone new walked in. That's when I first met Isaiah Carter. He showed up for spring football tryouts one warm Monday afternoon wearing a pair of borrowed cleats that were 2 sizes too big and a practice jersey somebody had dug out of the equipment closet. Tall kid. Long arms. Moved like the ground barely needed to hold him. I remember blowing the whistle for the 40-yard dash and watching him glide down that red clay track like the wind had decided to borrow a pair of legs. One of the assistant coaches let out a low whistle. "Lord," he muttered, "that boy can fly." And he could. But what I remember even more than his speed was the way he listened. Some players bounce around like puppies at practice, full of noise and energy. Isaiah stood quiet, eyes focused, absorbing every word like it mattered. By the 3rd day of drills it was obvious to anyone with 2 working eyes that he was the most naturally gifted athlete on that field. The boys knew it. The coaches knew it. And before long the town knew it too. That's when the phone calls started. They came polite at first. Booster Club men stopping by the practice fence. Parents lingering after games. Folks who had never once asked about our junior varsity roster suddenly very interested in how things were shaping up. "Coach," one of them said to me one afternoon, leaning against the chain-link fence with a toothpick in his mouth, "you think it's wise stirring things up right now?" Stirring things up. That phrase started floating around town like pollen. A week later the principal asked me to step into his office. Now Mr. Wallace was the sort of man who kept his desk so tidy it looked like nobody had ever done any work there. He folded his hands carefully when he talked, like he was handling delicate china. That day the blinds were half closed, slicing the room into narrow stripes of sunlight and shadow. He cleared his throat once before speaking. "Tom," he said, "nobody called me coach inside that office. The school board had a meeting last night." Anytime someone says a sentence like that in a small town, your stomach tightens before they even finish. He slid a yellow legal pad across his desk but didn't look me in the eye. "Some folks are worried," he said slowly, "that putting certain students on the football team right now might complicate things." I didn't say anything. He tapped the pad with his pen. "They feel it might be better," he continued, "if that Carter boy simply didn't make the roster." The room went quiet except for the distant sound of lockers slamming in the hallway. Finally I asked, "You want me to cut him?" Mr. Wallace sighed the way a man sighs when he hopes you'll solve a problem for him. They believe it would help keep the peace. Keep the peace. That phrase sat there between us like a heavy paperweight. I thought about Isaiah running drills that morning, sweat darkening the collar of his practice jersey. I thought about the way the other players had started looking to him during scrimmages, the way good athletes recognize something special before adults even admit it. Then I thought about Ellen and the little house with the crooked porch. The mortgage payment due every month. Sunday mornings at church where half the booster club filled the pews. Mr. Wallace finally looked up at me. "You're a young teacher," he said gently. "Promising career ahead of you. No need to make things harder than they have to be." Outside the office window the magnolia blossoms kept drifting down, slow and quiet. I stared at that yellow legal pad for a long time. Finally I asked one question. "And if I don't?" Mr. Wallace didn't answer right away. Instead he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands again, and spoke in a voice so calm it almost sounded kind. "Well," he said, "then tomorrow evening you'll be explaining that decision to the school board." That night the air felt heavier than usual when I stepped onto our porch. The screen door creaked behind me and Ellen handed me a jar of sweet tea. "You look like a man who swallowed a horseshoe," she said softly. I sat there listening to the cicadas for a while before telling her everything. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, the porch light hummed above us and a truck rumbled down the highway half a mile away. Ellen took a slow sip of tea and looked out into the dark yard. Then she asked one quiet question. "What kind of man do you want to be when this town is done watching you?" I didn't answer right away. But the next afternoon, as the folding chairs scraped across the gym floor and the school board members settled in to hear my explanation, I realized something important. I already knew. I stood in that gymnasium with my hands resting on the back of a folding chair, listening to the soft scrape of metal legs against the hardwood floor as the last board member settled in. The room smelled faintly of floor wax and old basketball leather. Somewhere down the hallway a screen door slapped shut, and the sound echoed through the building like a punctuation mark. 7 men sat at the long table facing me. Most of them I'd known since I was a boy. One had coached my little league team. Another had shaken my hand the day Ellen and I closed on our house. 2 of them sat 3 pews ahead of us every Sunday morning at First Baptist. That's the thing about small towns. When you disagree with someone, you don't argue with strangers. You argue with people who know what your mama cooked for supper when you were 10. Mr. Wallace stood off to the side near the bleachers, arms folded, looking like a man who wished he could melt into the varnished wood. The chairman cleared his throat. "Coach Reynolds," he said, "we understand there's been some confusion about the football roster." Confusion. People in positions like that love gentle words for sharp decisions. I nodded once. "Yes, sir." He tapped a pencil on the table. "You were asked to make an adjustment that would help maintain stability in the school during this transition." The pencil stopped tapping. "And yet we're told the Carter boy is still practicing with the team." I could hear the faint buzz of cicadas outside the open windows. The late afternoon air drifted through the gym carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass from the baseball field. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could smell so much like summer when my stomach felt tied in a knot. "Yes, sir," I said quietly. "He is." One of the older board members leaned forward. "You understand the concern, Coach." I did. Everybody did. Football in a Delta town wasn't just a game. It was pride, tradition, Friday night identity wrapped up under bright lights and marching bands. And right now that tradition was sitting in the middle of a national storm most folks here didn't fully understand but felt deeply threatened by. The chairman folded his hands. "No one is asking you to make a statement," he said. "We're simply suggesting discretion." Discretion. Meaning, Do the thing quietly so nobody has to talk about it. I thought about Isaiah again. About the way he stayed late after practice running routes until the sky turned purple and the stadium lights flickered on. About the way the other boys had started clapping when he made a catch during scrimmage. Kids, I'd learned, were often braver than the adults raising them. I cleared my throat. Gentlemen, I said, Isaiah Carter is the best receiver on that field. No one moved. The gym seemed to shrink around us. He's earned his spot, I continued. Same as every other boy out there. The chairman sighed, not angrily, more like a man disappointed that a conversation wasn't going the way he hoped. Coach Reynolds, he said, this town has managed to avoid the kind of trouble you see in other places. We'd like to keep it that way. I nodded slowly. I'd like that too. One of the men spoke up from the far end of the table. But? I swallowed. But if a boy earns his place on the team, I said, I'm not the kind of coach who tells him he lost it because grown men are nervous. That sentence hung in the air like a struck bell. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody slammed a fist. Small towns rarely explode. They cool down instead. The chairman leaned back in his chair. Well, he said after a moment, that's certainly clear. The meeting ended a few minutes later with polite nods and quiet chairs sliding back across the floor. No one threatened me. No one shouted. But the temperature of a room can drop 10 degrees without anyone touching the thermostat. I walked out into the evening sunlight feeling like I had stepped off a cliff and was waiting to see how far the fall would be. Word traveled fast. By the next morning the grocery store cashier greeted me with the kind of tight smile people use when they're deciding what they think about you. At church that Sunday the Booster Club president shook my hand just a second shorter than usual. A man who used to wave every morning from the gas station pump suddenly became very interested in the numbers on his receipt. Nothing loud. Just small shifts. Cold drafts where warm air used to be. But on the practice field things felt different in a better way. The boys played harder. Maybe they sensed something had been decided that mattered. Maybe they just liked having Isaiah on their side when the ball was in the air. Late one evening after drills he lingered by the sideline while the other players headed toward the locker room. The stadium lights hummed above us and moths bounced softly against the glass. "Coach," he said. "Yes, sir." He scuffed his cleat in the red clay for a moment. "My mama says thank you." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just nodded. "Tell her you're welcome." He looked up then, eyes steady. "I'm gonna make you proud out there." I remember smiling a little. "Son," I said, "just run your routes." That fall he caught 8 touchdowns. One of them won us a game with 6 seconds left on the clock under those bright Friday night lights while the band blasted through the fight song and the whole town held its breath. For a moment, just a moment, nobody cared who caught the ball. They only cared that he did. Life didn't magically smooth out after that. Some friendships cooled for good. Booster meetings grew quieter when I walked in. For a couple years I suspected my name floated lower on certain recommendation lists. But time has a way of sanding down rough edges. Seasons passed. New players came through the program. Isaiah graduated, then went on to a small college where he kept playing ball. I stayed in that town a long time. Long enough to raise 2 kids. Long enough to watch former players bring their own sons to summer practices. Every once in a while I'd see Isaiah back home visiting his mother. He'd stop by the field, lean on the fence, and watch the drills with that same focused look he had as a teenager. One evening years later he brought a little boy with him. "Coach," he said, lifting the kid onto the fence rail, "this is my son." The boy swung his legs and stared at the field like it was something magical. Isaiah nodded toward him. "He thinks I was a big star." I chuckled. "Were you?" He grinned. "I caught a few passes." We stood there a minute listening to the thud of pads and the whistle cutting through the humid air. Then he said something I've carried with me ever since. "You know," he said, "that year could have gone real different for me." I looked out at the field where the players were running a drill I'd been teaching for 20 years. "Well," I said, "you did the hard work." He shook his head slowly. "No, coach." His voice was gentle but certain. "You just opened the door." The sun dipped behind the bleachers then, turning the sky the color of old copper. And standing there beside that field, I understood something that had taken me half a lifetime to see clearly. Trophies gather dust. Scoreboards fade. But sometimes the quiet choices you make for one young person travel farther than anything that ever happened under Friday night lights. Even now, when the porch light hums outside my house and the summer cicadas start up in the trees, I think about that spring. About magnolia petals falling slow through warm Mississippi air. And about the day I learned that courage doesn't always sound like a crowd cheering. Sometimes it's just the sound of your own voice saying no when the easier answer would have been yes.